Greetings and welcome back to our channel. There are moments when an entire continent shifts, not with noise, not with fire or fury, not with bold proclamations in the media, just cold, quiet numbers in an October 2025 report, yet powerful enough to shake Washington to its core. And this shockwave bears a name: Canada's silent rise. Not with slogans or speeches, but through subtle, everyday choices made simultaneously by millions of Canadians. For decades, North America functioned like a well-oiled machine, the US as the hub, Canada the supporting engine, and Mexico the production line. But that seemingly stable system is now wobbling in the face of a new reality. When you line up the economic data side by side, one unprecedented fact becomes clear. Canada is entering the strongest period of economic self-reliance in its modern history. And this self-reliance isn't driven by confrontation, it's driven by quiet confidence. A shift that neither the IMF, the OECD, nor American analysts saw coming. In just 10 months, Canadian tourism revenue hit 84.2 billion CAD, surpassing the total of several key export sectors combined. But that's just the surface. What's truly shaking the foundations of North American power lies in a psychological shift. Canadians en masse are cutting back on spending in the US, choosing instead to buy Canadian, travel Canadian, invest in Canadian businesses. A small act when done alone, but when 40 million people do it together, it becomes a force capable of reshaping the entire flow of continental trade. Washington has long been accustomed to a quiet, stable, and dependent Canada. But the shock of 2025 revealed the opposite. It is the US that has become dependent on Canada, and that dependency is starting to waver. For the first time in half a century, the balance of economic power in North America is tilting in a direction no one expected. To understand this historic pivot, we have to start with what seemed like the smallest piece, but is in fact the spark behind all the change: the quiet withdrawal of Canadian consumers from the US market. From this point, the story takes us into one of the most unexpected upheavals of the new trade era, when Canadians in unison began closing their wallets at America's doorstep. There are turning points that make no sound, that aren't marked by solemn declarations, yet still powerful enough to pivot an entire continental economy. And the shift unfolding in Canada is precisely one of those moments. Among the flood of published statistics, one indicator left observers stunned. Canadians are pulling their money out of the United States. Not through a movement, not through politics, but through everyday consumer choices that are quietly spreading across the nation. For decades, Canadian economic behavior operated under a near-default setting. The US was the go-to destination, shopping in Seattle, Buffalo, Detroit, filling up gas tanks in Montana, weekend trips to New York or California. American cars sold in Canada were built on the assumption that local consumers trusted US quality and branding. This was an economic flow so stable, so ingrained, it seemed unchangeable. And then in 2024 to 2025, that flow came to a halt. The US raised taxes just as its domestic economy was in turmoil. The dollar fluctuated wildly, making every expense in the States feel more expensive. Political infighting in Washington bred uncertainty, prompting many Canadians to feel like they were funding a system that could no longer be trusted. And then, like a natural reflex, Canadians began making different choices. Weekend convoys to the US started to thin out. Border-adjacent outlet malls suddenly saw fewer shoppers with that familiar Canadian English accent. Sales at shopping centers along the US border plummeted, with some areas reporting their steepest drop in 20 years. And as this behavior spread, the once stable North American trade balance began to tip. Canadians turned inward, consuming domestically with unprecedented force. Domestic tourism surged, generating over 84 billion CAD in just 10 months. Restaurants, hotels, transportation, and entertainment services all experienced sharp growth. Local businesses from light industry to food production reported higher order volumes as consumers began prioritizing Canadian goods over American ones. What's remarkable is that no movement was ever launched, no Buy Canadian slogans, no media campaigns. This was simply a collective psychological shift, born from a desire for stability, a desire to invest in one's own country amid an increasingly uncertain North America. And that's precisely what Washington failed to anticipate. The change didn't come from the Canadian government, it came from the people. And when millions of small decisions add up, they can create a true economic earthquake. But that raises a far bigger question. If this shift is so powerful, why is the US helpless? Why, with all the policy tools at Washington's disposal, has it been unable to stop such a rapid cross-border trade decline? To answer that, we have to dig deeper into the very limits of the American economic system. Limits that have left it powerless against a downturn driven not by numbers alone, but by psychology and society. And that leads us into the next chapter of this story: why the United States is fundamentally incapable of reversing this collapse. What caught Washington most off guard in this downturn wasn't the drop in revenue itself, but the speed at which it spread, faster than any American economic model could predict. The US had grown used to viewing Canada as its stabilizing cushion. When other markets faltered, Canadians still traveled south. When American exports needed support, Canada was the dependable buyer. So when Canadians abruptly changed their behavior across the board, America found itself with virtually no tools to respond. OECD analysts dubbed it an external demand shock, a type of disruption where the US neither controls the cause nor has the means to correct it. Unlike domestic recessions or inflation, there's no policy lever in America that can simply make Canadians start shopping again. This isn't a problem of tariffs. It's not about stimulus packages. This is a crisis of trust. From 2024 through 2025, that trust was gradually eroded by political turmoil in Washington, rising tariffs, and a wildly fluctuating US dollar that made any trip south feel risky and expensive. And when consumer sentiment shifts, a chain reaction is inevitable. US automakers saw fewer orders. Tourism and retail sectors near the border watched their revenues nosedive. Towns that once thrived on Canadian visitors became ghostly quiet. And the most troubling part? Even if America wanted to step in, there's no way to reverse a trend that's already escaped the reach of policy, because no government can convince the citizens of another country to please come spend money here. No legislation can make Canadians feel that the US is more stable. No tax incentive is strong enough to override a nationwide movement to buy local. Once collective sentiment has changed direction, policy can only trail behind. It can't turn things back. Washington understands now that the problem isn't America weakening, it's Canada rising. As Canada becomes more attractive, more stable, and more confident in itself, the simple truth is it no longer needs the US the way it once did. And that's what's made recent reports in Washington so pessimistic. America isn't just losing revenue, it's losing influence. The shock isn't that Canadians are walking away from the US, it's that they're walking toward a new model of development, a model that the US doesn't control. And to understand that model, we have to look inward, to the core of Canada itself, where a transformation is taking shape more clearly than ever before. That brings us to the next chapter in the story. How is Canada rising? And what makes this new self-reliance so enduring? When the IMF and OECD released their October 2025 reports, many experts paused to read every line carefully, not because of the impressive growth figures in tourism or manufacturing, but because of something deeper. Canadian economic confidence had reached a level unmatched in decades. And what surprised them most was that this confidence wasn't built on US support. It was rooted firmly in Canada's own strength. For years, Canada had quietly built a foundation of stability that few Western countries still maintain. Inflation was kept in check more effectively than in the OECD average. Living costs, while rising, remained more manageable than in the US. Politics were stable, without deep polarization. Local governments upheld strong social welfare systems, and public services continued to run efficiently. These seemingly ordinary factors became fertile ground for a quietly growing, confident economy. More importantly, Canada chose a long-term path: self-reliance and sustainability over chasing short-term, overheated growth cycles. From 2022 to 2025, Ottawa quietly built three strategic pillars. The first pillar was boosting domestic consumption. Canadians began to realize that every dollar spent at home not only supported local businesses, but generated economic value far beyond, multiplying its impact across the economy. This drove exponential growth in services, transportation, tourism, and entertainment. The second pillar was diversifying supply chains. Canada no longer wanted to rely on the US to survive in an increasingly volatile world. By reactivating CETA, expanding cooperation with the EU, re-engaging with Asia, even with China, Canada was proactively building its own economic network, no longer tethered to its giant neighbor to the south. The third pillar was industrial autonomy. Investment packages in electric vehicles, energy storage, strategic minerals, clean energy, and high-tech agriculture were turning provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia into emerging industrial hubs. Canada's manufacturing ecosystem was evolving beyond its old role of assembly line for America to become a center of innovation and true production. These pillars combined to trigger a powerful chain reaction. Citizens grew more confident in the economy, businesses expanded their investments, and international partners began to see Canada as a more stable alternative to the US. A new cycle of self-reliance was emerging. Quiet, unannounced, but steady and profound. What worries Washington most isn't Canada's growth, it's how Canada is growing, without needing the US at its center. When a nation of 40 million, rich in resources, politically stable, and economically self-assured starts stepping confidently onto the global stage, the balance of power in North America begins to shift. And that shift isn't stopping at Canada's borders. It's spreading southward, reaching into US states that once depended heavily on Canadian spending. The ripple effects are now so clear, Washington can no longer ignore them. And so we arrive at the next part of the story, where cold numbers start to transform into real anxiety, the unease gripping northern US, states in the wake of Canada's economic shockwave. In Washington, internal reports have been pouring in from northern states. At first glance, they appear to be just numbers, drops in revenue, a decline in output. But when pieced together, a darker picture emerges. The US economy is experiencing an unprecedented reverse shock, one triggered not by a crisis, but by the quiet withdrawal of the Canadian consumer. In Michigan, the heart of America's auto industry, factories are reporting sharp declines in orders. Not because of a global slowdown, but because their most reliable market, Canada, is scaling back demand for American vehicles at a pace no one saw coming. Production lines are being cut back, and thousands of workers are growing anxious about the future. In Ohio and Wisconsin, parts suppliers for Detroit are being forced to reduce hours. No one imagined that a simple shift in Canadian shopping habits could disrupt an enormous supply chain stretching from Windsor to Chicago. Meanwhile, in North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, border towns that once thrived on Canadian visitors are now eerily quiet. Hotels no longer fill up on weekends. Outlet stores are reporting revenue drops of 30 to 40%. Restaurants, gas stations, tour operators, everything is slowing down in lockstep. And the most alarming part? This isn't a crisis caused by internal US economics. It's caused by the absence of what was once their most loyal customer base. It's not just retail or tourism feeling the impact. American agriculture is now taking hits as well. Canada was once a steady buyer of US beef, apples, grains, dairy, and countless other goods. But as Canada turns its consumption inward, American farmers are facing rising inventory, falling prices, and mounting financial pressure. Across every one of these reports, Washington sees the same trend. This isn't temporary fluctuation. It's the result of a deep shift within Canadian society, a shift the US has no control over. Because Canadians haven't just stopped spending in the US, they're actively building a new economy for themselves. And as they grow more confident, more self-reliant, more stable, the role of the United States in their economic system is steadily diminishing. That renders nearly every economic pressure tactic in Washington's playbook ineffective. But if this reverse shock has rattled US policymakers, the next blow is even more unnerving. Because just as the US was closing itself off with tariffs, Canada was opening up to the world. And that openness toward Europe, Asia, and markets the US can't reach has become the sharpest counterstrike to Washington's pressure strategy. And so the story turns another page. Canada isn't just turning away from America, they're making new friends. While Washington chose confrontation through tariffs, Canada took a completely different path, opening up, expanding, and stepping onto the global stage with the confidence of a nation that trusts its own strength. Rather than retreat under pressure, Canada began seeking new partners markets untouched by the political whirlpool of the United States. And this pivot became the sharpest blow yet to Washington's pressure strategy. In Brussels, Canada and the European Union reignited CETA, a trade deal once hailed as a strategic leap, but later shelved for political reasons. This time, it wasn't just revived, it was expanded to cover clean energy supply chains, battery production, pharmaceuticals, and high-tech industries. Europe, in search of stable and politically friendly suppliers, saw in Canada what it had long been missing: consistency and predictability. In Berlin, Stuttgart, and Paris, major European industrial giants began funneling investments into Ontario and Quebec. Not because they were abandoning the US, but because Canada offered a lower risk, more predictable environment, one that aligned perfectly with Europe's clean energy strategy. Battery plants, EV component factories, and green tech research hubs began springing up along eastern Canada's industrial corridor. But Europe wasn't the only destination. In Tokyo and Seoul, Asian conglomerates saw Canada as a new anchor for manufacturing, one that avoided the escalating US-China tensions. Even Beijing, while facing waves of tariffs from Washington, sought to re-engage Canada in the supply of critical minerals like nickel, cobalt, and lithium. Not out of ideology, but practical need. Canada has the resources China requires, and China remains a market Canada cannot afford to ignore. The world now sees Canada through a different lens. No longer just America's peaceful neighbor, but an independent economic hub, a safe haven in an era of geopolitical turmoil. And with every new partnership Canada forms, Washington's leverage weakens, because the more options a nation has, the harder it is to pressure. What truly unsettles the US isn't that Canada is opening up, it's how they're doing it, methodically, strategically, and at the exact moment America is isolating itself through tariffs. Washington has come to realize it misread the situation. It assumed Canada would shrink under pressure. But instead, Canada expanded, and in doing so, pulled supply chains further out of US control. This openness isn't just reshaping Canada's web of alliances. It has forced US intelligence and economic analysts to issue repeated warnings. Ottawa is shifting away from Washington's orbit, and this shift doesn't look temporary. It's beginning to resemble a long-term trajectory. From this moment, a phrase began appearing more and more frequently in classified briefings delivered to the White House, a phrase that, by its mere mention, sends a ripple of unease through Washington: de-Americanization, the quiet but deliberate process of removing America's economic grip on Canada. Inside the closed rooms of Washington, where classified economic briefings are reviewed long before any analysis reaches the media, one phrase is being repeated with striking frequency: de-Americanization, the unwinding of American influence in Canada's economy. It may sound academic, but to US policymakers, it signals a warning bell for an era they were never mentally prepared to face. The reports make one thing clear: this is no longer about isolated trade figures. It's about a structural shift. Canada is steadily reducing its integration with the US in consumer behavior, in supply chains, in industrial alignment, and even in long-term strategic vision. What alarms Washington the most is that this shift isn't being driven by any bold political decision in Ottawa, but by millions of quiet, everyday choices from citizens, businesses, and industrial hubs. As one analyst wrote in a classified report, "This is not policy, this is social psychology." And once a nation begins restructuring itself based on collective sentiment, it becomes harder to reverse than any law or trade agreement. This process of de-Americanization is most evident across four key areas. First, Canada is reducing its reliance on American goods and services, prioritizing domestic products or imports from Europe and Asia. Second, its industrial supply chains are being redesigned to operate independently of the US, particularly in electric vehicles, strategic minerals, and clean energy. Third, Canada is expanding international partnerships with the EU, Japan, South Korea, even China, undermining the US's long-held role as the region's default economic gateway. Fourth, and perhaps most unsettling of all, Canadians now have more faith in their own economy than in that of the United States, something not seen in decades. To Washington, losing market share is troubling, but losing influence is existential. A Canada that is self-reliant, diversified, and resilient means the US is losing one of its most critical economic levers for maintaining regional power. And what truly worries White House advisors is that this trend shows no sign of slowing. Every contract signed with Europe, every new battery plant built in Ontario, every Canadian who chooses local goods over American ones, each step pushes the de-Americanization process further forward. As these analyses pile up, one question begins to surface across confidential reports. If the U.S. is no longer the economic center of North America, what happens to the balance of power in the region? And it is this very question, heavy with consequence, that leads us to the next chapter of the story. A future that North America can no longer ignore as the continent's economic equilibrium begins to tremble. Where is North America headed when the center can no longer hold? When we look at the full picture of North America's trajectory over the past 2 years, one truth emerges more clearly than any chart or economic report. The balance of power is shifting. What was once considered the continent's default order no longer holds the certainty it once did. The quiet rise of Canada, paired with a steady erosion of trust in the U.S. economic system, has ushered in a moment where North America must confront a fundamental question. Where is the future heading? Amid this uncertainty, 3 potential paths are emerging, scenarios that could reshape the entire regional economic structure. The first scenario seems simple on paper. The U.S. steps back, lowers tariffs, and seeks to restore stability in its relationship with Canada. But this is far less likely than it sounds. Decisions in Washington aren't governed by economics alone, but by a deeply polarized domestic political landscape. Any move to concede to Canada could be framed as political weakness, making it almost impossible to adopt as a practical strategy. The second scenario, and perhaps the most probable, is that Canada continues to strengthen its new network of global partners in Europe and Asia. As CETA expands, as the EU funnels more investment into Ontario and Quebec, and as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and even China deepen cooperation, a new supply chain is forming around Canada, one that doesn't need the US at its center. This is a shift with profound geopolitical implications. For the first time in decades, Canada is no longer relying on the US as a prerequisite for growth. The third scenario, which is beginning to quietly take shape, involves a regional split in North American trade into 2 distinct blocks. One block, led by the US and Mexico, focused on low-cost, large-scale manufacturing. The other led by Canada, in alliance with the EU and select Asian nations, oriented around high-tech, high-quality, stable, and sustainable production. If this becomes reality, the economic map of the continent will change dramatically. America loses its singular dominance, and Canada emerges as the new center of strategic supply chains. But perhaps the most telling contrast doesn't lie in models or forecasts. It lies in the national state of mind. The U.S. is grappling with political division, financial volatility, and mounting social pressures. Canada, by contrast, is experiencing a rare collective mindset: confidence in the future, in stability, and in its own capacity for self-reliance. This psychological divide isn't just reflected in trend lines, it shapes the very decisions that each country will make in the decade to come. North America now stands at a crossroads, a continent that once functioned under a one-way dynamic. The US as the engine, Canada as the appendage, is evolving into a multipolar system, where choices are no longer dictated by a single capital. And as the old order begins to fracture, the question is no longer if change is coming, but rather who will adapt faster to this new era. Canada, calm, stable, deliberate, or the US, powerful but increasingly volatile? The next chapter of North America's story will be written in that answer. And like all moments of historical transition, it won't unfold with noise or drama, but in quiet, persistent shifts shaped by the everyday decisions of millions on both sides of the border. Looking back at the journey North America has taken in recent years, one thing becomes clear: change never arrives with a bang. It builds slowly, silently, through steady, cumulative shifts. And so it is with the story between Canada and the United States. Not a collapsed treaty, not a public diplomatic clash, but the quiet decisions of millions of Canadians. Small choices, made en masse, powerful enough to tip the economic balance of an entire continent. Canada has entered a new era not through confrontation, but through maturity. A country once seen as a satellite of the US economy now stands confidently on its own, building independent supply chains, opening its doors to the world and carving out a distinct role on the global trade map. Meanwhile, the United States, grappling with internal upheaval and unpredictable tariff strategies, is now facing the consequences of a dependency it once believed only others had to bear. But the most important question isn't who wins or loses, it's how the entire structure of North America is transforming. A new model is taking shape, more multipolar, more flexible, and perhaps more aligned with today's global realities. Canada is no longer standing behind the US, and the US can no longer assume absolute leadership. Both nations are entering a phase where the continent's stability will depend on adaptability, on clarity in policymaking, and on how each society envisions its future. The new era of North America won't arrive with fanfare. It will come through thousands of decisions made by consumers, by businesses, and by nations in search of reliable partners. And in that picture, Canada has chosen its path. Calm, deliberate, but full of inner strength. The only question now is, can the United States change fast enough to keep pace with its northern neighbor? If you'd like to continue following in-depth analysis on North American economics, trade, and geopolitics, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a single chapter in the story that's quietly rewriting an entire continent.